Hello, sophomores. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 12, Section 4. The war ends! Yay! So, let's get started here. The Third Reich is going to collapse. Starting in December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive in the European theater of the war, is going to take place. The Germans had mobilized a lot of their tanks and men to kind of the Western Front, if you want to call that, in Belgium near the Ardennes Forest. And if you know anything about the Ardennes Forest, there was some pretty major battles of World War I that were fought there kind of right at the very end of the war. And they're going to start this battle around December 16th. And about the time that they are doing that, the weather gets really lousy. It starts getting super cold, a lot of snow, as you can see in the photographs. A lot of stories about men who were kind of in the front of all of this, that if they were shot, they didn't really bleed to death because they froze. Kind of a story that you might hear if you listen to stories about the Korean War. But as a result of this, Germany lost a lot of valuable resources, such as their soldiers, because many of them were killed. They lost a lot of tanks, lost a lot of aircraft in this last-ditch effort. There's a story about one of our commanders who actually happened to be surrounded at the initial start of this battle. And the Germans asked if he would surrender. And he submitted a one-word response to the Germans, and it just said, nuts. And him and his men, they held out until they were reinforced. And eventually you had tanks that came up from Patton's division to support these men and eventually to break through the German line. So as a result of this, the Allies were able to kind of push the Germans back, and the Germans ended up having to cross the Rhine River back into Germany, opening up the invasion of Germany as a result of this and kind of the beginnings of 1945. And that is going to be ugly too, but nevertheless, by the end of February 1945, American troops had fought their way to Germany's last major line of defense in the west, and that was the Rhine River. It was very dangerous crossing that. They had to send engineering corps to make pontoon bridges. The Germans had kind of gotten wise and started dynamiting a lot of their bridges to make it harder for the Allies to pursue them. And our engineering corps just put together pontoon bridges and kept on moving. So it kind of talks about American ingenuity. Germany is eventually going to have an unconditional surrender on May the 7th, 1945. I should mention probably about a handful of days before, about a week before, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin as the Russians were surrounding the city of Berlin. And the higher-ups in the Nazi Party were kind of on the run. Some of them were trying to get out of the country as fast as they could so that they wouldn't get captured by the Allies. And on the 7th, we've got the surrender. And the day after, on May the 8th, we have what they call VE Day, or known as Victory in Europe Day. And that kind of marks kind of the end of the war in Europe. Granted, are the Allies going to take off and go elsewhere? Not so fast. I mean, they've got to find the Nazis who were involved in things like the Holocaust and find those guys who were the higher-ups in the Nazi Party that still were around. So it's not really quite over yet. And eventually we're going to have a tribunal and have the Nuremberg trials where we're going to put some of these war criminals to basically justice. Japan is eventually going to be defeated. And so the U.S. invaded the island of Iwo Jima in February of 1945. This island was kind of strategically close to Japan. We had kind of planned to launch airstrikes from the site with our new American B-29 bombers, which were the high-altitude super fortresses that had the pressurized chambers and the larger payload abilities. It was a super plane at that period of time. Starting in March of 45, the Allies started fire bombings of Tokyo. And these bombs were incendiary bombs. The goal was they would be dropped, and when they exploded, they would kind of ignite. A lot of them had like phosphorus involved in it, and for the most part, over 80,000 people in Tokyo were killed. And if you start counting the numbers of, property lost, lives lost, the firebombing of Tokyo ranks up there with the dropping of the atomic bombs as far as the damage that it caused. But it was horrific. And there were some people in the Army Air Corps that were questioning using such bombing campaigns. But if you look at it in terms of us, kind of like getting us closer to the end of the war, these fire bombs were probably a very useful tool, even though they're kind of considered to be very vicious. I mean, as far as how we went after civilians and such. So, to aid a possible invasion of Japan, the United States had tried to capture the island of Okinawa. The Okinawa is kind of the furthest point south on the Japanese archipelago. And the invasion of Okinawa was important because the U.S. Had captured the island. And as a result, it's going to draw us closer to wrapping up this war. But the people on Okinawa, the civilians, for the most part, have been really well indoctrinated by the military to run from the Allies. And in some cases, there were people in Okinawa that were throwing themselves off of the cliffs right by the sea to commit suicide rather than to surrender to Allied troops. So for those troops that were there, it was a very horrific kind of battle. The Manhattan Project was the secret program that the U.S. had started to build the atomic bomb. Back in 1942, Leo Szilard and Enrico Fermi, who you see kind of photographed down below, Fermi kind of by the chalkboard and Leo kind of next to Albert Einstein, they had approached him and said, hey, we think that the Germans are working on something very similar to this, trying to split the atom and develop a bomb out of it. And truth be it, pretty much every major country in the world was kind of secretly trying to come up with a bomb. Matter of fact, there's stories about the Japanese trying to come up with their own bomb, but the way the war was going, they didn't have the finances for it. And even for the Germans, the way the war was going, they really didn't have time to dedicate themselves to that science. But nevertheless, they built the first nuclear reactor under the football stadium at the University of Chicago. Just note that the University of Chicago had just gotten rid of football, and so the stadium space was available to them. And as a result of being able to split the atom, they are able to get the permission by the government to go ahead and try to find the energy that they need to generate the facilities to make the nuclear power, and thus starts the Manhattan Project. There were sites for this that were up in Washington State and some down in Tennessee. If you ever hear about the Oak Ridge area of Tennessee, that was a power generating center for this project. And then a lot of people hear about what was happening out in New Mexico, and that's where we get J. Robert Oppenheimer. In the photograph down below, Oppenheimer is the only one wearing the hat, so you can see. So the Allies, they threatened Japan with prompt and utter destruction after we had tested the first nuclear or atomic bomb in the summer of or in July of 1945. The deal is when they tested it, there was a lot of concerns about what this bomb could trigger, like a chain reaction of all atoms splitting. And there were some people that thought that maybe we would destroy the world just by detonating the bomb. Well, that didn't happen, but we did have a lot of firepower. The tower that this bomb was suspended from literally melted. The sand in the desert below the bomb turned into glass. As a matter of fact, it's still like that. Most normal U.S. citizens are not going to have permission to go out to the bomb site in parts of New Mexico because of the fact that it's still kind of a classified place because of concerns about radioactivity. But nevertheless, the thing worked. And the other two bombs that we had, we promptly put on trains and we got them out to San Francisco, where they were put on the USS Indianapolis, and they were sent to Tinian to be readied for the dropping of the bombs. So the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hastened what is known as VJ Day, which is the victory in Japan, due to the massive destruction and loss of life that these atomic bombs caused. Granted, I mentioned fire bombings earlier. Those bombs killed a lot of people, but when you can have two bombs that can kill just as many as maybe several hundreds of aircraft dropping bombs, it just kind of makes things a little bit more real. So, shortly after the atomic bombs were dropped, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. They got to get into it before the end of the war. And matter of fact, the Soviets are going to declare war on Japan after August 9th. They're not going to finalize their peace agreement with the Japanese until we get into like the 1990s. So it's kind of odd how long they were kind of at odds with one another. But on August 15th, 1945, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito ordered his government to surrender. And on September 1st, this delegation of men that you see dressed up here boarded the USS Missouri, and they signed the peace agreement to wrap up the war. So, building a new world. And number 11, President Roosevelt believed that the new international political organization would prevent another world war, and he was instrumental in creating the United Nations. The UN actually started having some of its meetings in San Francisco in the summer of 1945, before the dropping of the atomic bomb. And as the war in Japan kind of wraps up, the reality of this organization really kind of starts, kind of fleshing itself out. Eventually, the headquarters of the UN are going to move from San Francisco to New York City. At the Nuremberg trials, the International Military Tribunal, or the IMT, tried German leaders suspected of committing war crimes, and many were executed for their crimes. Seated below are Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess. I should mention Rudolf Hess left Germany during the war. He actually commandeered an aircraft, and he flew over England thinking he could get England to surrender. And obviously the English captured him and held him in prison until the end of the war, until they could put him on trial. At Nuremberg, because he was in British custody for a good portion of the war, he was given a life sentence, and he would die in prison of old age. But Hermann Goering, who is seated next to him, the head of the German Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, number 2 in command of the Nazi Party, he is going to be brought to trial. A lot of questions about his attitude. He was kind of, flippant about his responsibility. But on the night before he was supposed to be executed, he asked one of his American guards to go grab his suitcase, and inside of the suitcase there was a cyanide tablet, which he took and committed suicide before he could be hung from the gallows. The Allies did not put Emperor Hirohito, who you see pictured by Douglas MacArthur in the photo on the right, on trial in order to avoid an uprising by the Japanese. They did hold a military tribunal in Japan, and Prime Minister Tojo, Hideki Tojo, would actually be found guilty and accused of war crimes and be hung. So, thank you very much.